A student pilot took off around 4 a.m. on a rogue flight. He never made any radio calls, and then he made several low-altitude passes over a military base before crashing just a few minutes later. What they discovered in the wreckage and the truth about what happened would shock the entire community. That's why we're going to look at how he crashed, but more importantly, why was he even flying the plane to begin with? My name is Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Jet Montgomery was born on January 15, 2002 in Shreveport, Louisiana. He graduated from Airline High School and was attending Louisiana Tech University. I think it seems only fitting that someone named Jet from Airline High School would want to become a pilot. And on June 10, 2020, Jet began his flight training. Unfortunately, his first 10 hours of flight school didn't go very well. According to the instructor, Jet seemed to be more interested in taking pictures and showing off to his friends on social media. Now, let me be clear, especially for anyone thinking about becoming a pilot. It's an amazing experience to sit behind the controls of an aircraft and take off for the first time. However, flying is a very serious business, and if you don't treat it with the respect that it deserves, then you could easily get yourself killed. That's why I thought Jet's instructor did a really good job of handling this situation, because he had a long talk with Jet and he essentially gave him an ultimatum. Either put in the effort and treat this seriously, or go ahead and quit if you don't want to learn to fly. Now, thankfully, Jet started putting in the effort. He began taking notes and asking more questions. And 2 months later, on August 14, 2020, he flew his first solo flight and things seemed to be going well. Unfortunately, right before Jet was about to get signed off to do his first solo cross-country flight, he showed up at the flight school, and according to his instructor and some other witnesses, Jet appeared to be impaired and he had a slight smell of alcohol on him. Keep in mind that Jet is only 18 years old. In the United States, the legal age for drinking alcohol is 21. Thankfully, Jet's instructor and a few others caught him, and they did the right thing by kicking him out of the flight school. Now, normally that would mean the end of flight training for most student pilots, but you know that this is a pilot debrief, so things are going to get worse. The NTSB didn't reveal the exact date that Jet got kicked out of flight school or all of the details about what happened in the months that followed leading up to his crash. However, based on the information available, Jet was probably kicked out of flight school in late August or early September. Now, the reason the timing is important is because on September 12th, Jet posted this photo to his Instagram account with the caption, "Christmas came early." This is a 1973 Piper PA-28 Cherokee Challenger that Jet's father had purchased, and this would allow Jet to continue his flight training by hiring some different instructors. One of the challenges with this investigation was that Jet's logbook was never located, so there was little to no record of any of the flights that he did from August through December leading up to the crash. What we do know is that a certified flight instructor issued Jet a local traffic pattern solo endorsement on November 21st, 2020, less than 1 month prior to the crash. The instructor is quoted in the final report saying that the solo endorsement had two limitations on it. First, Jet was required to call the instructor prior to every solo flight to review the weather and NOTAMs. And second, Jet wasn't allowed to carry passengers as a student pilot on solo flights. We also know that sometime in late November or early December, Jet probably obtained his cross-country solo endorsement, and he did at least one solo cross-country flight because he told his father how he encountered clouds on a solo cross-country flight and it scared him. Mr. Montgomery said Jet knew to hit the autopilot if he got into trouble. This is where the story starts to get interesting because not long before the crash, Jet's dad reached out to hire a new flight instructor named Mr. Roy. And later, on December 15th, the day before the crash, Mr. Roy was sitting at home reading the Aircraft Pilot Operating Handbook so he could get familiar with the aircraft before he began teaching Jet. Jet's father called Mr. Roy that day to tell him that Jet would be stopping by the house to get the handbook so he could fly a solo cross-country the next day. When Jet showed up at the house between 6 and 7 p.m. that evening, Mr. Roy basically told Jet, "You're not going to fly the aircraft tomorrow," because the weather forecast was bad with low ceilings and poor visibility, and Jet didn't have an instrument rating. He also explained to Jet how the temperature was below freezing and the aircraft was not equipped for flying in icing conditions. According to Mr. Roy, Jet seemed to understand, and when Jet left the house, Mr. Roy had no reason to believe that Jet was about to take the aircraft on a rogue flight. On December 16, 2020, security cameras captured a vehicle driving through the gate at the Shreveport Downtown Airport at 3:15 a.m. The airport sits on the north side of the town, right on the bend of the Red River, and is only a few miles away from Barksdale Air Force Base. The aircraft wasn't equipped with a flight data recorder, but it had probably the next best thing, a Stratus 3 and a Garmin. Both devices were recovered at the crash site, and investigators were able to use the data to determine what happened. Jet started the aircraft near the hangars on the north end of the airfield, and then he taxied out to runway 14 just after 4 a.m. Remember, one of Jet's instructors told him that he can't fly solo unless he called the instructor to talk about the weather, and less than 12 hours ago, Mr. Roy told him not to fly because the weather was bad. In fact, when Jet pulled onto the runway, the weather observation was overcast skies with 300-foot ceilings and 6 miles of visibility. Additionally, according to the investigation, cloudy conditions were identified from the surface to about 4,200 feet, with wet fog identified below 350 feet, and the freezing level was about 1,900 feet. In addition to the bad weather, it's still dark outside, and Jet has very limited nighttime flying experience. Unfortunately, despite the warning from his instructor and the dangerous weather conditions, Jet took off at 4:17 a.m. As soon as Jet got airborne, he made an immediate left-hand turn to avoid flying into the Class C airspace associated with Barksdale Air Force Base and the Shreveport Regional Airport. There's two parts to this airspace. The inner part runs from the surface up to 4,300 feet, but the outer part is 1,600 up to 4,300 feet, and that part sits above the airport that Jet is taking off from. The reason this is important is because Jet is required to establish two-way radio communication with the controller before flying into the Class C airspace. Unfortunately, Jet never made any radio calls, and he continued that left-hand turn and flew into the airspace directly towards Barksdale Air Force Base. I think what happened is that as he climbed away from the ground, he immediately became spatially disoriented as soon as he entered the clouds, and he couldn't figure out which way he was going. And now he's put himself in a very dangerous situation, and the story is about to get worse. As Jet headed towards Barksdale Air Force Base, the controller immediately alerted the military personnel working in the tower at Barksdale. They also tried several times to contact Jet on the radio, but they never got a response. They watched on radar as Jet overflew the Barksdale runway a few times and made several turns to the northeast of the field. The tower controller turned up the airfield lighting as bright as it could go, hoping that Jet would see the runway, but the problem is that Jet's altitude varied from 500 to 1,500 feet above the ground throughout the entire flight. So with the overcast cloud layer starting at 300 feet, Jet never got low enough to get below the weather to see anything or get a sense of direction. Just to show you how dangerous spatial disorientation is, check out this video of someone sitting in a Barony chair. Now, I got to sit in one of these when I did my initial pilot training in the Air Force, and they're used to help pilots understand how important it is to trust your instruments instead of relying on your senses. The pilot is going to point his thumbs in the direction that he thinks he's turning, and when he first starts turning, the fluid in his inner ear moves, and that allows him to perceive the correct direction. The problem is that fluid in your inner ear is eventually going to stabilize, and as it does, his thumbs point up because his senses are telling him that he's no longer turning, but watch what happens next. As they slow the chair down, the fluid in his ear moves again, and now he thinks he's turning in the opposite direction. Even when he comes to a stop, he still thinks that he's turning. And when you're flying, it can be incredibly disorienting when your instruments are telling you one thing and your brain is telling you something else. And that's why you always have to trust your instruments. And if someone else is in the aircraft with you, let them know that you're disoriented so they can help back you up. Despite the danger of the situation, we still haven't answered the question of why Jet took off at 4 a.m. on this flight, or what else they found at the crash site. But I think this helps us to better understand what was happening during the flight, because it might appear as though he was trying to find the runway at Barksdale, but I think he probably had no idea where he was because of how spatially disoriented he is. It's also strange that despite how dangerous the situation is, Jet never tried to make a radio call to ask for help, and if you remember, Jet's dad said that the aircraft had an autopilot that Jet knew how to use, but it seems like he never used it on this flight. Eventually, Jet made his way over to the east, and his final series of turns is a classic example of a graveyard spiral. In a graveyard spiral, your brain is telling you that the aircraft is straight and level when you're actually in a descending turn. When you look at your instruments, you notice that your airspeed is increasing and your altitude is decreasing, and your natural reaction is to pull back on the controls because you think you're going to climb and stop the descent. The problem is that because you're already in a turn, when you pull back on the controls, all it does is tighten your turn and you end up descending faster and you spiral into the ground, and tragically, Jet did not survive. The most shocking discovery they made at the crash site was that Jet was not alone on this flight. Flying with Jet was his friend Jonathan Cole Harris, who was only 19 years old. John Cole was not a pilot, and Jet had specifically been told that he wasn't allowed to take passengers on his solo flights, and my heart goes out to John Cole's family because this never should have happened. The toxicology test revealed that Jet had amphetamine in his system that he was taking to treat ADHD. According to the report, concentrations greater than 200 nanograms per milliliter represent abuse, and the levels found in his blood and urine exceeded that. Alcohol was not a factor in this mishap. This brings us to the toughest part of the debrief, and that's identifying the root cause of the crash. The NTSB said the probable cause was the decision to fly at night in instrument conditions, which led to spatial disorientation, which I actually agree with. However, if we peel this back further, I'm sure that Jet's dad likely regrets his decision to buy Jet an aircraft around the time that Jet was getting kicked out of flight school. That should have been a huge wake-up call. Flying is a serious business and it requires a certain level of maturity. And if you don't take it seriously, the consequences can be deadly. Jet's instructors did everything they could to warn him, but unfortunately, Jet made a series of poor decisions, and I feel awful for his family because this never should have happened. And if you found value in this debrief, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.